All right, today we're going to be talking about how I got into being a handyman. So it actually goes back pretty far, even though I've only had my business for about 5 years. Essentially, when I was a senior in high school, I actually worked for my mother-in-law. Well, at the time she wasn't my mother-in-law, but my future wife's mother. She had a group of rental homes that she used for group therapy through her business. She was a psychiatrist, and she used these homes to do group therapy for kids and things like that. And she basically would buy houses and flip them and either rent them out or rent them to the business. She personally would buy these houses, as far as I know. There was a lot of things that needed to happen in a lot of these different houses. Anything from some electrical, drywall, installation of some fixtures and things like that. It was pretty straightforward, and I did that for about 6 months. The last 6 months of high school, I did that. And when I did that, it worked out fine. I mean, at the time I was making good money. It wasn't great money, but it was good money. In the grand scheme of things, she was clearly hiring me because I was not going to be as expensive as a normal person to do these items. But long story short, I did that for about 6 months, and eventually I stopped working for her because she was not content with the amount of work that was being done, even though there really wasn't a lot of work to be done, and I wasn't able to get enough hours to actually make enough to be what I needed to have at the time, even though I was still living at home. Skip forward a couple months, I started working at Target, and when I was at Target, I initially got hired as part of what they called a remodel team, where we would renovate stores, move aisles around, build displays, things like that. But at the time, Target was getting into trying to maximize the amount of groceries that they had in the stores, even though they weren't like super Targets or equivalent to a super Walmart. They were trying to make sure they had groceries and refrigerators and coolers and things like that for all of the normal groceries that most people would buy. So that's what we did, and then they tapered that project down during the holidays, and then it picked back up right after the holidays. But then I got promoted and did that for almost another year until I joined the military. And I joined the military because I realized very quickly while I was at Target that there was a ceiling on where I could go or how much I could make or the promotions I could get without college, and I just didn't have the ability to go to college. I didn't have the money, and I really didn't feel like signing up for a bunch of student loans. While I was in the military, I technically was infantry, though I rarely ever actually did any infantry stuff, because once I got to my duty station, they utilized me in a bunch of different ways with technology and radios and things like that. And then I deployed to Iraq, and I got injured while I was in Iraq. Basically, some orders came in, and I got a bunch of shrapnel in my gut and had to get sent to Germany for surgery. Well, the surgery was actually in Iraq, but then I got sent to Germany to rehab. And when I got back, I was still in, and I still had, at that time, 2.5 years left on my contract. So I had to find something else to do. Well, I ended up doing a lot of admin work initially, but then I started to get into barracks. And if you're unfamiliar with barracks are, they're kind of like apartment buildings, but for single soldiers who don't have the ability, or who live on base, and the Army provides housing for them. So imagine kind of like a mix between college dorms and apartment buildings, where there's a little bit more to each unit than a typical college dorm, but there's not as much as an apartment where most of it is only just one room, or there's two individual rooms with a community space that typically was a bathroom or a kitchen that was shared. At one point, while I was managing these buildings, I had over 4 different buildings with 120 units in each building. So I had almost 500 units, or 500, individual units that I was in charge of. Now, this ranged from, essentially, picture it like a landlord, where your job is to make sure that everything runs smoothly. You've got clogged drains, you've got broken screens that need to be replaced. Because they're single soldiers, they tend to get rowdy sometimes, so you have drywall repair. But essentially, if someone was moving out, you'd have to make sure that the unit was ready to go for the next person moving in. And it was not like the typical rental market. It was very fast turnaround. You need to make sure that unit is ready to go within a couple of days because there could be somebody else moving in right behind them. I did that. I really enjoyed that. Eventually, I got medically discharged from the military because my unit at the time was deploying and I was unable to deploy because of my injuries, and they needed to basically move my slot to somebody who could deploy. So I went back to doing admin work until I got out, and then when I got out, I ended up working at Best Buy, selling computers, and then I worked in a warehouse at a different location once I moved back to Illinois. And then after that, I moved from that location to a warehouse. And for the most part, it's not that I didn't enjoy working at Best Buy, but the biggest problem was that I've never really been the type of person who takes, it's going to sound ridiculous saying that I was in the military, but taking orders, or I guess I could take orders, it's just, I want to make sure whatever I'm doing makes the most sense. Common sense should rule everything. And I would question a lot of things, and some of my supervisors, not in the military, because I flourished in the military with supervisors because I guess I just had a different attitude compared to most, even though I knew I was low on the totem pole. But when you get into the civilian world, it's very different, and I just didn't mesh very well with just taking orders that didn't make a lot of sense or didn't add up to being just common sense. At the time, my wife and I had gotten married years before this, but my wife and I were expecting our first kid, and I was working at this warehouse for Best Buy, and at the time it was good money, but ultimately I was running into problems where childcare was an issue, and my wife made significantly more money than I did at the time. So I decided to try to come up with something that I could do differently, where I wouldn't have to worry about childcare. So for a while, I ran an eBay business where I basically went to thrift stores and things like that, bought stuff, flipped it, cleaned it up, and then resold it on eBay. I did that for a long time. And I was pretty good at it, but my entire intention was that once my kids were going to be in school full time, I'd find something else to do where it wasn't that, where I wasn't at the house. I'd be able to go out and do something that I enjoyed. And fast forward a long time, because it ended up being about 8 years before that was going to happen, because I had 2 more kids. And my youngest was born in 2016. And when he was born, it was a couple years later that we talked about moving from where we were to a new house. And it just so happened that when we moved, we put our house on the market literally a month before COVID, and then had to deal with COVID between trying to still sell the house, but also still try to buy a house at the same time. It was a fiasco. But one of the things that I got into before we moved was I was anticipating having to do a lot of work. The 3 different houses that I've lived in since I was married, we've always had a lot of things that need to get done. We've always needed to get things within the house done, not giant projects. The biggest projects we did in our last house was we redid 2 full baths and a powder room. However, I didn't actually have anything to do with those. We actually had a company do that for us because I wasn't skilled enough to do those, tile work and things like that. So essentially, in preparation for potentially moving somewhere else, I started to look into, I found some different YouTube channels online where they were talking about fixing things up and things like that. And one of the ones I came across was the Handyman. If you're not familiar with him, he's been around for maybe 10 years at this point, but he's been around for a long time. He runs a business and he works by himself. He does all kinds of projects. Nowadays, he does a lot of bigger projects, or at least that's what his video shows, a lot of bigger projects. But I found him and then ultimately found his channel, the Handyman Business Channel, where he talks about how he started his business. And it motivated me to start thinking about that as an option for what I would eventually be able to do once my kids were all in school full time. And that something that was very interesting to me because it went back to work that I did years ago and work that I enjoyed when I was in the military and when before, like one of my first jobs working for my future mother-in-law, I really enjoyed doing that work. As a kid, I used to build tree houses and forts with scrap wood that my dad would have. My dad was real big about having a tool bench and, you know, trying to have the right things for the right tasks, and doing a lot of it himself. That's how he, you know, taught me how to be, was trying to make sure that you could do everything yourself. Now, the difference is that I know my limitations and there are certain things that I know I can't do. But fast forward to 2020, I end up moving. After I move, we are we ended up moving into a new construction house. So there really wasn't a lot to do except for painting and just, you know, installing some fixtures, swapping out things like that. But it was very simple stuff. But I realized very quickly that if I'm doing this stuff in my house, how many of the other houses in my area, which are new construction, are also looking to do the exact same stuff? And are they able to? And I started to do a little bit of research to try to figure out if it was even feasible. And I noticed that there really wasn't a whole lot of handyman companies or handyman people that were showing up online. And then I ran into a very interesting dilemma. I had a shower rod in one of my bathrooms that needed to get installed, but it wasn't a tension rod. It was one that drills in. And I was trying to drill it into tile, and I was very concerned about cracking the tile. This is something I never did. Watched some videos online. They of course made it seem very simple. Borrowed a drill from my dad at the time, which was a corded drill. Used some bits, started drilling the holes, realized very quickly that either I had the wrong type of bit or the drill wasn't powerful enough because the bit itself started to get so hot that it was turning orange. So I decided it was probably more than what I could take care of and attempted to call a local company to get it taken care of. The first thing that happened when I called this company was, and I honestly don't even know if this company is even around anymore. When I called them, there was, I think, 3 companies that I called total. The first company said that they could come out, but they would charge $100 before they'd even step a foot in the house, which is a service charge. I'm very familiar with them. I do them myself now, but to me as a homeowner, I was like, well, you don't even know what I need done, and you're telling me that you're going to charge me $100 before you even know what to do. I didn't really like that idea. Another company, I left a voicemail. They never called me back. And then I had another company that I also left a voicemail. They did call me back, but then basically said that they were booked out for like 3 weeks or something like that. And at that time I was like, okay. So I ended up just trying to figure out on my own. And I ended up figuring out on my own. Needed to buy some different bits. That was the biggest thing. But I realized that there was definitely a market for a handyman company. And at that point, my current business that I was doing with, you know, running an eBay business, I hadn't really set it back up because I really wasn't looking. Like, I had stuff that I still had to sell and things like that, but once I moved, I needed to reset everything up. So that business essentially floated my initial investment for what I do, or what I do with my business now. It bought the money that I made from that business ended up buying a lot of my initial set of tools. I started out with a giant Ryobi set. I think it was like a 7 or 8 piece set, and that 7 or 8 piece set had, you know, all the basic tools: a driver, a drill, a grinder. I think it had a vacuum, like a little dust buster or whatever. It had a light, little circular saw. It had essentially everything that you would potentially need. And then I watched a couple of other videos online about things that were very helpful to use, and I started slowly buying these items and compiling them on my dining room table, because we don't use the dining room table. And basically from there, I started to come up with, how can I make this work? Now at the time, I ended up, I thought about how I'm going to afford the other aspects of this, like the insurance and things like that, because everybody always says when you're watching videos, you need to make sure you have insurance. And I wanted everything that I was going to do to be legit, because I really did want it to work. And you can't go into something with the intention of, I'm going to make it work, but I'm not going to do it the right way. So while everything was sitting out on my dining room table, one of my cousins was over, as well as a mutual friend between him and myself that also happens to be married to his sister, my other cousin. And the two of them collectively said that they were interested in looking for a side gig, and this could be an option for them to, I guess, join my idea. And in my mind, I thought to myself, well, this will work, because then we can spread the cost of how to do this out between the three of us. At the time, I really wasn't sure how much cost there was. Like I said, the insurance was something, but obviously there's certain aspects of just like forming a business and things like that. And I knew I made a mistake years ago when I created my business for eBay and turned it and created an LLC for it. There was an issue with I spent a lot of money that I probably didn't need to use or didn't need to spend creating the business. But at the time, I didn't know how to create an LLC other than going through, something. And I think I ended up using something like LegalZoom. And the problem was that it cost a lot of money. And it was a lot of money that at the time I probably shouldn't have spent. And I was concerned between the insurance and the forming of the business and things like that, that it could get very costly. So the idea of bringing on partners, especially because at the time I thought, well, if I have jobs that are more than one person, that's perfect. I've got people built into, the business itself. That didn't work. Long story short, about 2 years after we formed the business, I ended up buying both of them out. Because it just didn't work. They had life situations that changed. They ended up having small kids, and the whole idea was I was on the opposite side of that. My kids were grown up to the point where they were in school. So they had small kids, and they weren't able to really have a lot of time to do jobs. And to be honest, I didn't have a lot of jobs that required more than one person. There was jobs that you could use a second set of hands, but I didn't have a lot of those jobs. And in the beginning, it was very easy just to have jobs that I just did on a regular basis. And I was personally working full-time hours every single week for the business. And occasionally there'd be a job that would come up maybe like once every other month or something like that, where they would be able to get a couple of hours. But in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really make a lot of sense to keep them on board, because they were still technically footing the bill for certain things like the insurance and the stuff that was yearly costs. It was also, for me, it was hard to try to justify having to spend money on like a software program or something like that with people who don't have any idea what the purpose of any of that stuff was, because I did all of the behind the scenes work for the business. So I ended up buying them out, and since then, that was in, I think, 2023. Since then, it's just been me. Now, last year I started using a couple of subcontractors for some different projects, some larger projects, and I think that's the route that I'm going to be going for the foreseeable future. I still don't have enough jobs on a regular basis to have a second set of hands on a regular basis to like, hey, I've got work, you can come work for me, and I can make sure that you're making enough money to make it worth your time. I have work that is sporadic when it comes to needing an extra person. The other side of this is that my oldest son, he's about to be 16 this year, and he can do a lot of those other things. If I need help carrying something, he can help me carry stuff. If I need help with just like general, helper type work, grunt work, whatever you want to call it. He can do that kind of stuff. If I need someone just to like mop up and sweep up and do things like that, I can bring him along. He can make some money, and then the money that he makes, he can use it to help him, to help pay for a vehicle down the line when he gets his license. And that's basically where I'm at right now. But the idea is that there's a lot. The business came from an idea that generated from basically what can I do with my skills that I have and make it into something that's profitable. Now, that's not to say that I can't be more profitable or I can't be more efficient. I obviously can, but a lot of that's going to be things that we'll bring up on future episodes or future videos. But the idea is that I truly think that everybody, whenever you watch any YouTube channel, you're always going to see people say anybody can do this. It's got a very low bar of entry, and I definitely agree with that. I think there is a difference between anybody can do this and anybody can be successful at doing this. And I think that's the biggest thing is you have to have the drive to be able to do it, but you also have to have people skills. You have to be able to have a certain level of, you either have to be very profitable where you don't have to be book smart to do the accounting, to do the marketing, to do all of that stuff. And if you're able to pay someone to do all that stuff, great. I didn't, and I had to end up doing a lot of that stuff myself, which, like I said, we'll talk about that in the future. But I just wanted to take a moment with this video specifically talking about where I came from and how I got to be the owner of this business. And there's a lot more things that I'll dive into in the future when it comes to why a partnership may or may not work for you. What you can do that doesn't cost a lot of money and is something that can help your business a lot. I'll talk a lot about a lot of that stuff, but there's a lot of, like I've said before, there's a lot of different YouTube channels out there, and I hope that you guys can get something out of mine. And along the way, I'm going to suggest other ones. I mentioned the Handyman business channel earlier. I'm going to put that one down in the comments for you guys to check out. Make sure you go back to some of his very early videos because he gives a lot of really good information, especially for those of us who are starting out. And as we go, I'll bring up some other YouTube channels that I've come across, and I've learned a lot of different things, even though in some cases I was well beyond what their initial content is designated for. There's definitely things you can pull out of essentially any of those YouTube channels that are out there. So hopefully you guys get something out of this, and I appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions that you'd like to have focused on in future episodes, I'm always going to call them episodes. I used to have a podcast not related to any of the stuff that we're talking about here, but I was always an audio person. I'm trying to get more into video because I watch a lot of YouTube stuff and I'm involved in a lot of YouTube stuff. So I'm hoping that there's stuff that you guys would like to know, and if there is, leave those comments down below, and hopefully we'll cover those on a future video. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you next time.